Yeah. Well, I'll start kind of at the beginning of where I think a lot of my advice today and my philosophy comes from. And as I was talking with Jay before we started recording, I would like to share something that I've never publicly shared before, if that's okay with you, Jay, because I think it truly will
Sure.
resonate with your audience and this concept of turning your struggle into strength. Because as young as I can remember, and to be honest, I think I blocked out the age that it initially had happened. Um, there was a time in my life where, both my parents, humble upbringing, were teachers. With that being said, sometimes their hours were long and they needed daycare for my brother and I. And I ended up in a daycare facility where, gosh, I had to have been maybe 5, 6 years old. For a couple of years, I was sexually assaulted. And I didn't know what I didn't know until you're in school and they're saying, hey, you shouldn't have strangers talking to you a certain way,
Right.
let alone touching you a certain way. And then you had that
Yeah.
moment like, wow, this doesn't seem right. And then, it comes to the point where you work up enough courage to tell your parents because you've been told not to tell anyone by this individual. And you're a rule follower, so you don't want to break the rules and you also don't want to get in trouble and you don't want to get hurt or anything further than already is happening. And I remember working up enough courage to tell my mom, and obviously the shock and the terror and the embarrassment that she had felt leaving me in the care of someone else who had done something to your child, right? And at that time, 30 years ago, literally, makes me sound old. But back then, you didn't really talk about stuff like this. And you certainly
Right.
didn't want to be the talk of the town when you live in a small town on an issue like this. So, and I don't fault my parents, but instead of doing something, they did nothing because they didn't want to bring further attention to a situation where perhaps it
Right.
could have caused embarrassment for me. So the
Yeah.
thing that happened was I was removed from said setting. And again, I was so young. I don't even remember the first time that it happened. And it was now the summertime, school was out. Clearly, I'm not in daycare anymore. My dad brought me to football practice, and I would sit on the sidelines of my dad's football practice, and I would watch these grown high school boys grunting and slamming pads. And, I used to make fortresses and doll houses out of his, football pads. And I used to sit there bored out of my mind. But one day, the field hockey coach walked by because she had practice at the same time as my dad. And she looks at me and she's like, you know what? I think you should play with this. And she hands me a field hockey stick. And probably as young as maybe 7 or 8 years old, from that moment on, I took what felt like desperation and despair and feeling of helplessness and insecurity, you name it, trauma, and I channeled it in a way that made me feel alive again. And it gave me the strength and the confidence to move my body and to have control of my body where I didn't have it before with another individual. And I started leaning into that. And I mean, it's so cool to look back today and say, wow, and you went through some pretty dark stuff and you came out the other side a fully sponsored Division 1 athlete. At the time that I graduated, I was an NCAA 4-time academic All-American, was actually one of the top 10 female NCAA athletes out of every sport that played.